happy to keep talking about this reporting project that I did. And if you haven't listened to it, you can find it on WBEZ.org. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why I did this project. So in late 2020, all these years with COVID start to blend together. I received an email from our managing editor saying that there was a new fellowship, the Richard C. Longworth Media Fellowship. Richard Longworth was a correspondent for the Tribune for many years, and he was starting this fellowship through the Pulitzer Center for Midwest journalists to report on international issues. There's been a lot of foreign correspondents who've been cut as the media landscape has changed. And so this was an opportunity for journalists to pitch an idea that they wanted, along with support from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Clinton Family Foundation. And I thought, oh, I think I want to go to Finland. I don't remember when I first heard about their open prison system, but I have been paying attention to abolitionists in Chicago and what they have been calling for with prisons. Now, to be clear, open prisons are not what abolitionists are asking for, but I am intrigued at Chicago being the epicenter for a lot of the discussion around how to do things differently and how to have radical imagination. And we know that a lot of the Nordic countries do things better than we do in the United States, but I thought it would be worthwhile to take a deep dive and go there. So I went in August and spent a couple of weeks there. I visited 3 prisons, 2 in a town called Humane, which is about an hour and a half from Helsinki, the capital. I visited a men's prison and a women's prison. And the 3rd open prison that I went to was in Suomenlinna, which is in an island, and it's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So an open prison really means that people can leave to go to work and to go to school. One of the questions that I asked early on was, are there any books that are banned? Because we know so many books are banned here in prisons in the United States. I've learned that my book on the Blackstone Rangers is banned in Illinois as well as other prisons. And I was looked at like, what are you talking about? Why would we ban books? So the idea is that you're doing something productive. The buildings physically look like youth hostels. They tended to be on farms, and 1/3 of prisons in Finland are open. What was really unique about the prison system is that it's developed by researchers, not politicians. One prison director told me, oh God, no, politicians are not involved at all in how we do prisons. And decades ago, Finland had a prison system that wasn't different from a lot of prisons that we see around the world, where punishment was key. There is a prison museum in that town, Hämeenlinna, that I got to visit. And, it looked like how we might expect a prison to look. And the research showed that that does not rehabilitate people. So they came up with this open prison concept, and it's been growing, especially since the 1970s. And I would say a couple of things that really stood out to me was the number one question that I had been asked when I have come back was, are open prisons for nonviolent offenders? And that is how we tend to think about reform in this country, is violent versus nonviolent. There is no distinction in Finland. You can have committed murder and you can still be in an open prison. And life in prison does not mean a life sentence. It is 12 years. We'll talk more about comparing Finland to the United States, which is something that people have a lot of questions about. But I went into this thinking Finland is roughly the same size as Cook County as far as population. Finland has 5.5 million people and Cook County has 5.5 million people. So I like to play this clip of audio from one of my interviews. You'll hear my voice too. This was part of a feature story by my colleague, Erin Koa.
it was said that maybe one day there won't be prison anymore in this island. We never know. Maybe one day these ministries of justice and education and culture, they don't want prison here anymore.
I never thought a prison director would tell me this is a possibility that maybe one day we won't have prisons. And I was like, oh, wow, you sound a lot like some of the people here. It's a boulder up a hill. There was work before me that journalists did or reformers. There's the moment that we're in now, and then there's the future.
So that was from our membership drive, and Aaron was highlighting some of my work. And that was at the prison Sommelina. And when I was there, I learned that there had been an architectural contest. And you can see some of the pictures online. They look like a summer resort, might be too strong of a word because I wouldn't say it's luxurious, but more of a campground feel. And that director told me that maybe one day there wouldn't need to be prisons. And so therefore you would have this hostel-like environment where people could vacation there. So some of the barriers that I ran across would really be that I wasn't able to talk to people who had been in the prison system who were no longer there. I wasn't able to connect with any of those groups. But I will say that Finland has opened government in a way that frankly would make us blush here in Illinois, Cook County, Chicago, the United States. I had no problems getting into the prisons. And even when I interviewed people who were in prison, the press people would walk away to give me privacy. That would never happen here. They even said, oh, would you like to visit some closed prisons so you can have a comparison? And I hadn't even thought about that. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to because of COVID. So really my biggest barrier was I wasn't able to see as many quarters as I would have wanted to because of the COVID situation. And so the women's prison that I visited also had a mother's wing, and there was only one mother who was there. And mothers with children can stay there until they are 3 years old. There were no cells, just like there aren't cells in open prisons in general, but these had an even different feel. I was able to go inside and see a living room and see toys and see board games and see a playground. So Illinois likes to talk about its family prison unit, but it still doesn't compare to what I was able to see in Finland. So I would say one of my aha moments was something that's called the Nordic theory of everything. I could have done any series of stories in Finland around housing, around public education, and I still would have come out with something similar. So for a country like Finland to have a prison system like this means that other systems in the country are working. And I interviewed a woman who wrote a book called The Nordic Theory of Everything, where she really lays out the ethos of the country. One of the criticisms that she says she hears, and you might have heard this too, is that the Nordic countries are nanny states, that these are countries that baby and infantize their residents by doing everything for them. And Anu Partaran, who's a journalist, said it's actually the opposite. There's trust in the government to take care of things so people don't have to take care of them. So if you aren't worried about paying for childcare or having expensive childcare or health care or elder care, you are free. And you are free to have other pursuits and not think about these other things that are really hard for most Americans to navigate. And I want to play another clip now from someone who's incarcerated, whose name is Miko. He spent years in a closed prison before transferring to the open facility in Sommelina.
they trust us more. That's the big difference. Because in closed prison, prisoner can feel that someone doesn't believe that he wants to do good things and be trustful. Closed prison can be more problems because people cannot see they have something outside. I think that's the problem.
And do you feel like prison has made you a better person?
I think prison itself doesn't make anybody a better person. That depends what that person do when he is in prison. So I think this time has made me a better person. But some people in prison and what I have done here, that makes the change, not the system itself.
It's important to note that Finland and the United States took very different positions in the 1970s. In this country, we had tough on crime, war on crime, the changing of our prison system under President Nixon. And in Finland, it was the opposite. And the recidivism rates are low, even if you have open prisons. So it's really a philosophy about treating people better. That doesn't mean that the system is perfect. I heard from a number of people that more mental health treatment is needed. Drugs and alcoholism are very high for the prison population in Finland. And I also learned that the needs of women are not always addressed. So I mentioned the mother's wing, and there was a woman who was serving life in prison. Again, that doesn't mean actual life. And she was pregnant and she was transferred to an open prison. And you can't stay there past 3 years old. And so this January, her daughter was turning 3 and she was going to be separated. The prison director, the woman in prison, all appealed to the president of Finland. And I learned right before my story came out in November that she was rejected. The prison director there also mentioned that she sees a lot of human trafficking for women and that there is a cycle of women being victims as well as perpetrators. Sometimes women maybe have committed a crime against someone who was an abuser. Another woman I met was a senior citizen who was a drug mule. Based on her story, I think that she was scammed. The prison director thought she was scammed too, but there didn't seem to be any leeway to understand that. And this prison director gave different examples of where she thought women were actually victims, even if they did something that was not smart or that was a crime. So the system is not perfect, but definitely a lot better than what we see here. So the big takeaways are, how can humanity be prioritized over punishment? Is there any way that this could happen in the United States, could happen in Cook County? Finland does not have the same racialization in the criminal justice system that we have. And so as I was reporting, I kept thinking 5.5 million, Cook County. And the woman who wrote the Nordic theory of everything says, for any of these issues, whether it's healthcare or prisons, people say to her, well, why are you talking about this? The United States is too big, it's too political, it's too diverse. And her pushback was, there are states, there are local governments that have a lot of control of some of these issues. And so why not start there? And I think that is a salient point to think about. And so that's my very brief overview about why I was there. And I would finally like to say that even though I was there in August, it's still a little bit of a rough re-entry for me to be in a place where people really trust government and to come back home. And no matter what your political affiliation is, there isn't any trust. And I'm not suggesting that there should be trust or that the government doesn't do untrustworthy things, but to be in a society that operates like that and to come back home. And there's so many examples of where we see a lack of distrust, not just on the federal level, but even in our own city. It's hard, and I wish that we did have something different. So now I would like to introduce our guests for tonight's discussion. They have all made strides toward improving their communities and the criminal justice in unique ways. So please help me welcome Richard Wallace, Sharon Mitchell Jr., and Trina Reynolds Tyler. Richard Wallace is the founding executive director of Equity and Transformation, known as EAT here in Chicago. EAT works toward social and economic equity for Black Chicagoans engaged in the formal economy. As a formerly incarcerated person, Richard has fought immense odds in his journey as a community organizer and thought leader. And I really wanted Richard here because I've been covering his work, but even when I was in Finland, I was still doing a few daily stories, and I had to interview him on a time difference in Finland. And we spent the first 30 minutes talking about what I was doing in Finland. And I wanted to get his thoughts. So I haven't heard what he's thought about the series, so I'm looking forward to hearing that. Next, we have Sharon Mitchell Jr., the Cook County Public Defender. He was sworn into office in April of last year. The Public Defender's office is one of the largest in the nation. Previously, Sharon served as the director of the Illinois Justice Project, a policy reform organization working to reduce inappropriate incarceration and recidivism and improve community safety outcomes. I believe Sharon and I are both Morgan Park High School graduates, so big ups to MP High. And we have been on panels together before. And so because I had Cook County in the forefront of my mind doing reporting, I thought it was great to have him join us this evening. And finally, we have Trina Reynolds Tyler, who I'm just getting to know. She is a data journalist for human rights at the Invisible Institute and a graduate of the UChicago Harris School. An active community organizer and abolitionist, Trina's been involved in mutual aid efforts on the South Side, and she currently serves on the advisory council for an anti-militarist youth organization. Through researching police misconduct and restorative justice, Trina's work is focused on helping Black and Brown communities create safe spaces outside of the carceral state. So thank you all for being here tonight. I first want to start off by asking each of you, what did you think of the week-long series, and what did you think about open prisons? And I'll turn it to you first, Richard.
Thank you for having me, Natalie. It's good to see everybody. Most of us know each other. It's a small world here in Chicago. And so I'm excited to be here for this discussion. I was excited when you were there and you were sending me the text messages and letting me know what was going on. And then we also had our chance to do the interview. And it was hard for me to even really imagine an open prison, right? I'm like, what does it look like? Like, you know, I'm like, there's gotta be a catch, right? Like, don't people just run away? You know what I mean? Like in my mind, I'm like, couldn't they just leave? And when you told me about the living conditions, that, you know, that folks were able to leave and go to work, and folks were able to be connected with family, it wasn't like a severing of a human from everything that they know and love. I grew, more interested in both the story, and then also like I was curious about, I want to go to Finland and see this for myself. Some of the first things that came to mind for me were like, what is the per capita income? What does the employment statistics look like? And then to see that, they have wraparound services, including things like childcare. It just made me believe that, I think one, a lot of what we consider or what we demand is considered revolutionary or super radical. And these are the norms in other places, right? That we take care of the entire family, that we ensure the children are fed and nurtured, and that you have leave from labor so that you can take care of your children. These are also attributes that were present in Finland that then make the reality of open prisons real, right, at the end of the day. So it's not just open prisons, high rates of unemployment, lack of access to childcare and lack of access to economy, and I think the explicit anti-Black racism here in the U.S. It is the inverse of those things, and open prisons, which opens up the door for a whole new conversation. So I was excited when I listened to the story, read the story, and I've shared it with a number of my friends who are also abolitionists. And then I think for me, as a person who spent time in jail, I know what I needed when I went to jail, right? And I needed help, right? And I didn't need, I didn't need 23-and-1, right? I didn't need those things. And so when I saw that this was a it almost didn't sound like a prison to me. It sounded like a program. And so for me, that was a bit more exciting. When we begin to think about, what are the alternatives, I think Finland is definitely a location we should look. And I'm excited to see where the conversation goes today.
And I would like to add that people in prison cook their own food in the kitchens. They do their own laundry, and income and social inequality is low, which contributes to a low prison rate. Trina, when I was there, people asked me, why are you here? Why did you come here? And I would say Black feminist thought and abolitionist. And as an abolitionist, what are your thoughts on this? And Richard's right, it is more of a program.
So one, thank you so much for writing this piece. I ended up printing it at home and putting my highlighter to it. Because at the end of it, what I appreciated about it most was that it was able to touch upon this piece specifically around gender-based violence. A lot of people are not thinking about the way that women are impacted by mass incarceration. And I'm speaking to maybe even being incarcerated and maybe having, coming back to the stories of some of the women in your piece around either being scammed or sometimes women are tricked into things, manipulated into things. I'm in relationship with so many young women. And so you can see the flags and you can see the lack of resources in order to protect or support young people who are encountering within relationships where they may feel encouraged to do something to engage in criminal activity. And then on the flip side, just thinking about how women are, specifically Black women are sometimes uniquely positioned to be like, am I going to call the police? And will me calling the police put this person in jail? And then how will that, the negative impact that has on the survivor of violence themselves, right? So then it's like we find folks in this position where the way that the system is set up, it's like you kind of can't win for lose, or I forget the phrasing of it is, but it's like, do I call police and do the labor of maybe going to court and getting this person out? Or do I just kind of stand my ground because the way that the system is set up, it's not built to protect survivors. I think the last thing I will share in this moment is that your piece made me go back to a book called Incarceration Nations. And one of the chapters of Incarceration Nations speaks about Norway, because they also have open prisons. And they speak to this principle of normality, which is that punishment is the restriction of liberty itself, and which mandates that no one shall serve their sentence under stricter circumstances than is required by the security of the community, right? So it's like keeping in mind that how do we keep people safe because someone maybe has done something violent, right? And also what does it mean to not further traumatize that person who is committing acts of violence. And there was one more thing I just wanted to quote before I stop, which is that the way that people even within this book describe it is that it's like they have their life. It says we have our life stopped, frozen. And it makes me think about how within at least the way that they're speaking about open prisons, It's just that like it really gives people an opportunity to pause, because when you're going through the data, your daily life, and you're encountering stresses, you're struggling with substance use disorder, right? Like what can it look like for you to take a pause in order to gain access to treatment? And the people in Norway, they have access to the same treatments that citizens have access to, right? And so it's like, as if this kind of infrastructure of care exists inside or outside of the prison, right? There is more space and opportunity to prevent crimes from happening in the first place and to support survivors of violence.
One of the scholars who I talked to also edited a book that University of Chicago Press published called Crime and Justice in Scandinavia, and talks about the other Nordic countries. And the open prisons give inmates contact with the outside world. And the point is also to help them transition back into society. And speaking of liberty, he said that the punishment of taking someone's liberty was punishment enough. I also wanted to talk about you do mutual aid, and that's not the term that they use, but the scholar illustrated the difference between neighborhood watch programs in the US versus Finland. So here, the emphasis is on surveillance and reporting suspicious activities, and then Nordic emphasis is on joint neighborhood activities and mutual assistance. Sharon.
It's tough because the first two answers were incredible. There's not much more for me to add. I will just add, it's funny, I think it's extreme sadness. Extreme sadness. I think that to think that there are places on this very same earth that are so less cruel from the way we treat our own people. I think Richard brought up a great point that sometimes folks who talk like us are seen as radical and exotic and are pie in the sky. This is wild and crazy stuff, right? This can't possibly happen, right? But there are people who share this very same planet that may not be doing it perfectly, but are doing it with such less cruelty. And to think about where we're at now, given the size of our incarcerative state, given the fact that, there are over 600,000 people with a felony in the state of Illinois, that if you put all the people in jail and prison and on probation, it'd be the second largest city in the state of Illinois. Given the fact that there is real political value in that cruelty of incarceration. It seems so far away. But for me, there is a little bit of hope, because there are people that are fighting to remove this cruelty. And when you have pieces like this, they can't be dismissed as radical. They can't be dismissed as people who just don't understand how the way the world works, because there are places on this earth that are doing it better with less cruelty.
That's a really good point, because this is not considered radical in Finland, and you don't have politicians who run on crime the way that they do here. And speaking of that, we have a question for the panel from Philip Beverly, who is watching on YouTube, who asks, how is real prison reform possible when so many politicians run on law and order platforms that prioritize punishment over rehabilitation?
I think it's very difficult, but I think that we need to be realistic about how the status quo has failed to keep us safe. That right now we live in a society that pays billions and billions and billions of dollars for unusual cruelty, and the byproduct of that spending has been complete and utter failure in the lens of reducing harm. So when I hear people are running on crime and running on law and order, let's be clear that they are not having a serious conversation about how their approach works, because they are doubling down on things that don't work if your goal and our shared goal is actual peace and actual communities that are thriving. Now, I will say that there are people that are not running on that are running on the cruelty, that may not share our hope that we live in communities that are safe and free, that maybe they're hoping that we live in divided communities where there is profit in punishment. So for those people who, if we want to get to a place like this, I think we need to have very serious questions about what we're doing here in Illinois, how that has worked.
Richard, Trina, you want to weigh in on that?
I'll weigh. I mean, I definitely will weigh in there. Trina, do you want to go? I'll let you go first, or you can go first. I know you got the data, so hit me with the numbers.
No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So, I mean, I think for me, I feel like, incarceration has never worked. Since its inception, it's been, for me, I feel like it's been a means in my research, it's been a means to extract, labor value from Black bodies, right? The moment we come home as an incarcerated person, we the value of our labor drops dramatically. It has been a racist tool, it's been a very punishing tool. And I think for me, it's like the growth of prisons in the US is in stark contrast to the beliefs held by the folks who support prisons, right? If it is a deterrent from crime, then why has it grown tenfold since, you said in the article, since 1970, right? If it's growing, it's not deterring, right? And so it's just, I think just lifting up the contradictions plays a role in how we get to that vision of a US, or of our country without prisons, of a world without prisons, is lifting up the contradictions. But then also kind of highlighting the fact that, and calling people out that run on fear, because essentially that's really what they're running on. It's not really that they're running on safety, they're running on fear, right? We have one of the most expensive police budgets. We have prisons all up and down. And the reality is that the safety in the community hasn't increased, right? And so they're literally running on fear. And I think that's, for me, I feel like there's something there that we have to massage, I think, as organizers and thought leaders and advocates within this movement, is like, how do we expose the contradictions in ways that make our narrative make sense? You know what I mean? Like, even though we already know it makes sense, but how do we cut through the fear in ways that produce outcomes like candidates that run on in Illinois without prisons, and run a slate of candidates like that? You know what I mean? Like, I think we have enough brilliant minds here in Chicago that have been doing organizing. And we have some great journalists that'll report on it, right? That we can begin to kind of build this, but I think that it is a strategy that is winnable long term, and I think that it can happen.
So first and foremost, I would say that law and order does not have to mean what it means right now. Like law and order, this idea of like law and order, like it's like there can be law and there can be order without like human rights violations, truly speaking. Also on the point of like people running, if I had it in me, I would definitely run for office. Lord knows that that's not going to happen anytime soon. And I know there are so many brilliant people who could run for office, but there is something about when you are an elected official, when you're in that position, I think a lot of times you're faced with, the major crisis, which is that everybody's scared. I'm scared, right? I mean, I live in a neighborhood where carjackings occur. I mean, I think more and more in Hyde Park, folks are like, oh, like we see it in our neighborhoods. Now it's like, I was just about to walk there. And it's like, that's actually been the norm for so many people in Chicago, been the norm for so many Southsiders and others, right, across the city, because the South Side isn't the only side of the city. But I feel it's important to really, when thinking about like the kinds of conversations we have in the future about safety, right? We have to understand that other people's well-being, our well-being is dependent on other people's well-being, right? When we're thinking about, like, if I am in my crew and I have a substance use disorder problem and my crew is able to support me, pull me out of that, that is powerful. If my crew is actually in a position where we are actually all going down this pathway of substance use disorder, and we like it's like all of our issues are all connected, because like we are all in community with one another. Somebody's child, your next door neighbor, who their child may be the person who runs into you while you on the bus stop, you know, like anything is possible. And the truth of the matter is, it's like, we cannot think of the world as our little homes and our little neighborhoods. We need to think about the way that we are all connected, because as people are seeing the kind of like spillover of crime into, the Hyde Park streets, and people are, saying like, oh, it's in my neighborhood now. It's just like people are taking action in these particular ways as a reaction to another thing, right? And as once we get to the root of those issues, then we are now preventing the crime from happening, or intervening before it escalates to the point of like mass casualty. So that's my hope, is that we think about public safety differently, and law and order. Like there can be law, there can be order, and also abolition.
What do rehabilitation, accountability, and restorative justice look like in practice? Or what should they look like in practice?
It looks like consent, first and foremost. Like, I think there's a whole, the like current, the undercurrents of like issues are in many ways deeply rooted in like boundary crossing, right? And that's like across many communities, regardless of like your socioeconomic background. Like there are many issues that stem from, and then the conditions that you live in, right, that exacerbates, that can exacerbate the situation. So I think it looks like consent. I think it looks like resources and care, like childcare. I think it looks like housing, because when folks are living in overcrowded conditions, and maybe even possibly living with their abusers. I know Long Walk Home came out with a report about how young women are basically like stuck in the house with folks who have abused them in the past or are abusing them. And where do they have to go? Like, where can a teenager right now, or even like a young mom go, and if she doesn't feel safe in her home? Like, that's what restorative practice looks like to me, because I see a lot of people who have been stuck in the same condition day in, day out, and they're forced with some decisions that I could not imagine have to make. And also they're not given, many people are not given opportunity for emotional development. Like, I see so many young people in conflict, right, about petty things, right, issues that can easily be mediated within community without intervention from police. But because folks don't have those toolkits, and because folks are afraid of calling police, because police are going to come with the cuffs, and they say, and you never know what will happen. It's just like, I think there's like a roadmap of care that has to, at the very least, cover people's basic human rights, and like communal care, so that we can really better understand the way conflict is happening in communities. And because there are things we can anticipate happened. We know things have happened in the past. And instead of putting the Band-Aid on, we're going to send this individual to jail. It's important to know, oh, this individual is actually a microcosm of a larger social network of people who have a shared experience. And this will continue to happen. And we will continue to fill up jails until we actually get to the root of this to make sure that it doesn't happen again, or check it early in advance, early on.
I guess I'll go, Sharon. I see you. I'm just going to speak. I mean, I wasn't going to come out of a book, but I'm going to come out of me, right? What was my experience? February 21st, 2006 was like the day I changed my life, or I think my ancestors changed my life. And for me, what did that look like, right? I remember calling my mama, and I was out in the streets kind of bad. And she asked me on the phone, she said, "Are you done yet?" And I was like, "What you mean, am I done yet?" She's like, "Because your people need you." My mom's if you don't know my mom, Reverend Doris Green, is a minister and activist. And I said, all right, I'm trying to change, right? So I got on a bus, came back to Chicago, and she surrounded me with love, right? I think that was one of the first things. And I often think about what was the difference between me and my homies that I was out in the streets with. And that was, my mom was able to plug me with a full-time job doing HIV prevention work as soon as I got back. So in 2007, I was working full-time. At the same time, I was staying at a shelter. And I was able to save up enough money to get an apartment. And that apartment ended up being in Douglas Park. And I was super excited because I got that apartment. It took me a year to get it, a year and some change to get it. But I stayed in a space, with other folks that were also going through similar circumstances, trying to change their life. So I had some housing, I had the job, I had mentorship, tons of mentors, brothers that were wrapping their arms around me from day one, brothers like, Dr. Charles Knox at the time. This was Dr. Starks, Dr. World, Fred Hampton Jr., Mama Akua, right? That I was put into a community, right? That was like, no, we ain't gonna let you fail. And then from there, I got my job. Then I ended up going back to school. And I got my education, right? And so, but it was one thing at a time, but it was, so that's my idea of rehabilitation, restoration, et cetera, is that like, one, my community never let me go, right? My community also, those same people were in my life the entire flick, right? I did not turn to that audience until 2006, right? When I was ready, they were still there. So I think some consistency, in relationship to the holders, like the people that are committing to holding people through this process of rehabilitation. It is a commitment to hold them regardless of what shape they're in. I think a lot of times we're in a place where we're like, if you aren't exactly where we want you to be, we're gonna throw you away too. And that's not just the folks that are in the carceral setting. Those are people in society, right? Those are often the programs, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to be in a position where we're going to hold people through their failings. And then when they're ready, right, be able to offer them the things that they need in order to survive and take those next steps, right? For me, that was employment. For me, that was housing. And no lie, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I think that one thing to keep real, the first time I had 3 meals a day, right, was in the joint. Right. The first time that I had 3 meals a day outside of the joint was when I was at a homeless shelter. Right. And so I had to get into habit of like eating 3 times a day. I had to get in the habit of like literally taking care of myself. And then from that, I was able to get the hard skills I needed to be able to survive right in the world. Right. And then when I got into the world, again, that world was Douglas Park. I was super stoked. Right. And my mom had to help me get towels and sheets and all the different types of stuff. So it was a lot that went into it. And that same core network of people are still in my life to this day. Right. And so for me, I think about that. I want to come out of some of my restorative justice books and hats and whatever. But in reality, my real life is an example of what can happen. Right. And from there, now I'm the founder of a nonprofit organization. I done got fellowships. I done graduated from college, all of those things. But it started with a firm commitment by a network of people that were not going to let me go, and a job and some stable housing, right? And so I think about what does that look like, and for me, I think that is a perfect example of what we can do. I think about programs like Guaranteed Income. Shout out to the Chicago Future Fund. I'm gonna go ahead and name drop that right now, and ensuring that people have access to some form of economy. I think we cannot divorce the open prison conversation from the broken economic conversation, right? Like they both go hand in hand. Like our people in West Garfield Park, our people in Inglewood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, where you see the spilling into the Hyde Park communities are coming from communities that are completely severed from the wage-based economy that this country is built on, right? And so we got to begin to think about why are folks making the decisions that they're making, and ultimately, in a lot of these situations, they're making these decisions to eat, right? And no pun intended, equity and transformation, whatever. But like in my mind, that's what we have to begin to think like that, and we got to begin to see crime as an indicator of a need opposed to a place for punishment. And so that requires a lot, but I think, hopefully I answered some parts of the question there.
Sure, I want to just add a follow-up to whatever you might be answering, but now that you're in a different role in the public defender's office, what have you learned that you didn't know prior? And if you were able to redesign something about Cook County Jail or pilot something, what would that possibly look like if it were just someone just gave you the keys and said, Sharon, we trust you, come up with something?
It's a great question. Wow. Fortunately, I had the blessings of working at the public defender's office as an attorney well before I moved into this role. So I think I got to see at a ground level, both as a young public defender, while somebody who grew up in the city, rehabilitation in the system is a joke. We don't take rehabilitation seriously in the state. There are thousands and thousands of permanent punishments to somebody's criminal record. Thousands. I was in a policy conversation with our policy group just today, and I was talking about a bill that our partners at the Fully Free campaign are running. And it's a bill whose only goal is to ensure that people with a criminal record can act as the executors to their deceased loved one's estate. I mean, when somebody has a criminal record, right, we don't allow them to put their family's affairs into place. And there's that barrier, and there are literally thousands of other barriers. So if I had the keys to the system, right, I would be asking very seriously, why do we use incarceration so much when we know it makes a person's situation worse? And then when a person leaves that incarceration, why do we continue to punish them in thousands and thousands and thousands of ways so that we incentivize literally the conduct that we are putting people in for, right? So it would be that. If I'm going to spend billions and billions of dollars on this, then I would be thinking deeply about how do I destroy the system? How do I work myself out of a job? With that said, I think it's important for people to know that, rehabilitation, right, is one of the 4 reasons why we have prisons. Like they taught us in law school, right? The rehabilitation is one. But please note the rehabilitation is a footnote to the other 3. Retribution. Our system is so cruel because we get mad at people and we want to hurt them and we want to harm them, right? Our system isn't built with the reality that 97% of people are coming home. It's built to hurt people. That's why when you tweeted about this country, you tweeted about Finland, you had so many replies that people like, oh, that seems too nice. That seems too nice. We have to hurt them. There has to be bars. Where's the gray? Where's the suffering? The second is deterrence. And we think that putting people in prison is a deterrent. When we know that people eating is the reason why people do the things they do. There are certain people that make bad decisions, but what happens if we just let people eat, right? You talk about in your story about the social safety net of countries like Finland, but please note that our current system uses jails and prisons as drug treatment facilities, that use prisons and jails as mental health clinics, that use prisons and jails as trade schools. So while other countries provide these services without the cruelty, we do it too, but we do it with so much cruelty and with no acknowledgement of effectiveness, right? Does not matter how effective putting these things in prison. Does not matter how effective it is that people got to get 3 square meals. Their first 3 square meals are in a prison. And then finally, incapacitation. Remember that prisons exist to take people and put them away so that we can ignore the problems of our society. And if I had the keys for the day, incapacitation would not just be about hiding. I wouldn't assign to this idea that we got to put people in prison so we can hide from our problems. I would want to build a system where we're using those dollars, those billions and billions and billions of dollars, to not hide from the problems, but to solve them. Those are my thoughts.
I did read one of those tweets to a prison director. It said prison is supposed to be punishment, not a group vacay or acute B&B. And she responded, I put that tape into the story that said, if you raise children and you punish them, they become worse. And if they are rude to people in prison as prison staffers, if we put them in dark places, it won't work. Do you want them to be released from a dark cell? And one friend I talked to when I came back said that she had that reaction of, oh my gosh, this sounds so nice, but that she had to check herself. Why do I feel that way? What have we been taught to feel about prisons and how to deal with crime and with punishment? Richard, because you have been incarcerated and you know what you didn't get and you know what you needed, do you think some form of an open prison would be the right thing in Illinois?
Yeah, minus the term prison, right? I think we got to abandon the terminology. That was one of the things that I noticed in the story, is that there's no realizing anew by holding on to old terminology, right? I think that calling it, there needs to be a new discussion on what we call it, right? But the humanizing folks who have made mistakes, right? And like, for me, I felt like what that was, that prison, we'll call it prison for now, was the realization or like the humanization of folks who have caused harm in real life, right? Like it was a construction, right? That was, I think at its core was a belief that we have to humanize folks who do harm as well, right? And so that's why you get compassionate aspects, like you can be with your children. That's why you get compassionate aspects like we're going to give you trades, or we're going to, that you can leave during the day. All of that because it's, I think at the end of the day, they know that society benefits by the return of folks who are humanized, right? Opposed to the way that we do. And it's so sad when I was thinking about the tweets, that our society is so hell-bent on punishment. It's like fed to us in every commercial, every movie, you know, punishment, get them back. You know what I mean? Like it's just part of the hegemony or whatever you want to of the U.S. right? And at the same time, it's actually it's hurting us long term. And so I'm just kind of caught up on that right now, and I'm just thinking like, how do we get people past punishment? And I'm not sure how. People punish their dogs and their children. You know what I mean? Like, and I mean, and even us as a people, like we've learned to punish our children from people who punished us. And so it's just like, how do we break the cycle of punishment? Yeah, and I mean, if you think about how it webs out into our education, it webs out into everything that we do, webs out into our employment, and how we punish employees who don't do A, B, or C, right? Like, so we have to begin to construct a world that's absent of punishment, to realize that, you know, the aspirational vision of like open prisons and whatnot. So, yeah, I think long and short, yes, I think open places for folks that are incarcerated or folks who have done harm is a brilliant idea. And I would love to see something like that happen or even piloted in Illinois.
A lot of people are commenting on YouTube this evening that the prevalence of violent crime, particularly gun crime in the US, as compared to somewhere like Finland, how does that affect the way you think about an approach like the Finland model happening here? And I should just add quickly that gun crimes are low in Finland because guns must be registered and licensed on a per gun basis. We don't have that in the United States. Most guns are used for hunting. Firearms are only used in 14% of homicides. Knives are more common for homicides in Finland. So again, the question is, how does gun violence affect the way you think about doing a different approach? And I'll just add, you know, doesn't have to be Finland as you're thinking about something radically different.
So I'm going to comment on this question. I wanted to just really quick come back to this open prisons. So what's beautiful, and I even saying it out loud, what I can appreciate rather about open prisons, or just the kind of the ways that they practice incarceration in these areas, is that, so there's also like village prisons, right, where it's like 25 people and it's like a small, it's a small crew of people. And so, and then there's also like, they're working the land, and it's like, you know, they have a philosophy, like I'm reading, y'all, I was so into this book as soon as I learned about this event, just like they're working the land, and just like how they're literally, while they're there building an ecosystem, they're working cohesively towards the improvement of the land, period, instead of us doing this thing where we're like outsourcing jobs to prisons so that we can pay people really low wages and make things cheap. That's one thing. But as far as gun violence goes, and I'm sure we all share this as having lost, maybe having lost people, like native Chicagoan. Last year, I lost 3 people in a 7-day period, and 2 of those people were from gun violence. I have students, young people who I know and love, who carry guns, not because they're outside shooting people, but because they're afraid that they might get shot, right? They're like, I need to protect myself. I mean, and then even like, all the way to the range of like, we've seen in the news where somebody, right as soon as they got out of jail, like somebody was waiting on them and then they were murdered, like stepping right out of Cook County. And so like gun violence is a real thing, but gun violence doesn't actually have to happen. Gun violence exists because of conflict that's happening on the ground between community members. And that conflict, conflict has been solved in the past without gun violence. Like I think when I was 13 years old, 12 years old, the first person who I ever knew who was murdered, they were on their way to a peace kind of treaty, and somebody was nervous and pulled the trigger, and he ended up, passing away. Phil is his name, right on 53rd and 54th and Drexel. But that's an instance of like, some people are literally looking for peace. People are literally walking in fear. And if the conditions were different, if our system was set up differently, and if we engaged in conflict resolution in a different way, I believe that gun violence would go down significantly. And one place that has done a really interesting practice, Precious Blood Ministries. I was trained by Precious Blood Ministries in circle keeping. My Aura Shub, rest in peace to her. But one of the things that they did was they would actually host media circles with folks who were perpetrators of violence, like the shooter and the family, right? The family of the person who was lost, or like circles between like rival gangs, in order to literally stop the conflict. And I think I believe wholeheartedly, if we employ more means for like mediation, conflict resolution, and like instituted more support systems within like people's homes, we would not see the levels of conflict that ultimately results in gun violence.
I'll go. Oh, no, Sharon, go ahead.
I think it's a really good question. I think that, as we all know, gun violence is, I think it's fair to say, to me, our biggest challenge in the city. We should own that. What I would say though is, how have closed prisons dealt with gun violence? How have spending billions and billions of dollars on training and armed people who show up after a shooting happens, how has that worked? How effective has that been in reducing gun violence? How effective have taking people who are arming themselves, who don't shoot, sending them to prison and cutting off their ability to earn for their families, right? How has that slowed down gun violence? We often meet reformers or abolitionists' demands with, well, how it would work, or what are the results? And we never ask those same questions to the status quo. The status quo is like never means tested. Look what we do in response to the violence we see every day, and ask yourself, how effective are we at stopping that violence? I cannot express enough the ridiculousness we are in right now, where we train thousands and thousands and thousands of people to show up with guns after shootings happen, or show up with legal briefs after shootings happen, to put people in jail or put people in prison after it happens, only catching a small amount, by the way. And we spend a fraction of the cost on people to stop it before it happens. The status quo is insane when it comes to violence prevention. What we're doing is insane, and the results we see every single day on the news. Like, what are we doing? What have we done today that's going to make the results different from yesterday? Nothing. So we got to ask ourselves those critical questions about the status quo. That's all I say.
Yeah, I like everything that you lifted up, comrade. This is if you look at Lincoln Park, they always try to make this, it's complex. It's not complex. You look at what makes Lincoln Park safe. I think probably a couple of years ago they had like one shooting in Lincoln Park. It was random, right? What makes Lincoln Park safe? And all the programs, you can throw all the programs, and our community is like all these experimentation. We got experiment this. What makes them safe is the median household incomes, the employment statistics in in Lincoln Park, home ownership in Lincoln Park, right? These are the pieces that, and you look at West Garfield Park, you look at Inglewood, you look at home ownership, you look at median household incomes, look at this, that, and the other, and you'll be like, oh, I wonder what the problem is. The problem is the same, I mean, where is a violence prevention program for Lincoln Park? Right? Where is the solution for Lincoln Park? The solution for Lincoln Park, whatever you're using to fix Lincoln Park, use it to fix our communities too, right? And that is access to economy. That is access to living wage employment, the average median household income out. I cannot have my statistics in front of me. If I did, I would we go to church, y'all. But I don't have it all in front of me right now. But if you look, break Lincoln Park down, and I dare Chicago to give our communities exactly what Lincoln Park has, right? That is the solution to it. And I think that oftentimes we want very simple solutions to a very complex equation. There are multiple variables in motion as it relates to the gun violence in Chicago. A lot of it is that is outside of our control, right? Who has control of the means of cultural production, of how we see ourselves? And this is not, I'm not trying to get deep, but I'm just being very real, right? I'm being very real. Like, I remember for me in the streets, let me just keep it a buck with y'all, right? Like, we would be like, we could harm each other, but you better not harm that white person walking through the block. And there's something wrong. There's something that trained us to know that if we harm that white person, help will come. But if we harm each other, help won't come, right? So we've already like embodied this ideal that the system is not built for us, right? When Trina was talking about, you know, Black women who are survivors of particular harms that are conflicted with the decision, do I call the police, right? Who has historically only caused harm on my family and on my loved ones, and for this in this situation, and that could possibly place her at risk or that person at risk, right? And I think that for the people that are the naysayers, it's like, you don't see the world the way that these people do, right? If we honestly believe that the solution to any of this violence is that there was someone who could come in and intervene in moments where violence was, or intercommunity violence was on the precipice of occurring, what do you think we use it, right? There isn't a solution for us currently, right? And so a lot of folks are reverting into like, I got to do it myself, whatever. But even that is being informed by something, right? That is outside of our communities, control of our communities, right? And I got to be real. It has to do with radio. That plays a major part in how I see myself, right? I'll see people that'll be critiquing what's happening on the streets, riding by bumping the soundtrack to it, right? And so we have, and even with that, we aren't in control of who. Look, I'll say this. I was also an MC in Chicago, and I might as well get into this, right? And in my time as an MC in Chicago, right, it was 2011, 12, 13, and the music industry really didn't know they hadn't commodified streams yet, right? You know what I mean? So you had this beautiful texture of Black artists, full expression, right? You have folks like Spank Rock and you had Kid Cudi coming up during that time. It was independent. You had to put out music by yourself. There was no record labels that were really controlling the industry. And you had a diversity of Black music. So you had some trap and some drilling, but you also had like the MIAs and the, you know what I'm saying? And the Santee Golds and the Spank Rock. You had a diversity, right? But the second it gets commodified again, they produce what it is that you can listen to. And then the shorties ultimately look at that as a pathway out, right? So we've made the Hunger Games, right, in our communities as a pathway out, a pathway to survival, right? And that's part of this as well, right? And that we ain't talking about like, yeah, we gotta, all this other stuff has to happen, right? But I promise you, there is no quick, easy solution to the gun violence in Chicago. A lot of it has to do with us having access to controlling the things that we consume. And we don't have access to control the things that we consume. And we have to gain access, right, to the things that we consume audibly, diet, right? All these things play a part in what we're seeing unfold as intra-community violence. And prisons hasn't fixed any of it. Prisons don't fix any of those things. It doesn't fix hunger, doesn't fix the food deserts, it doesn't fix, the music industry, none of that stuff, right? And so for me, it exacerbates it. Exactly, Sharon. So I'm gonna get off. Yeah, that's my take, is that it is extremely complex. There is no simple solution to it.
Well, to your point about Lincoln Park, I said this earlier, but it's worth repeating in case folks weren't on live with us, that the researchers in Finland say there's strong evidence showing if there's any single factor that explains lethal violence, it's income differences and social differences. And the differences there are much smaller than we have here. We have someone who pointed out, a lot of people watching tonight are pointing out the racial differences between Finland and the US and our long history of institutionalized racism. And what does that mean for the possibility of using a Finnish criminal justice model here? I'll just say quickly that when I went there, I thought, oh, well, everybody's white there, so of course, this is why they have this system. That was a little too simplistic. I do have a separate series on Afro-Finns that's not related to the criminal justice system. But as some other scholars pointed out, there are other models in Europe that are not like the US, and they have much more diverse populations. And I don't have time to get into Finnish and Nordic history, but I think that our system says more about us than it says about how they don't act, because they have a complicated relationship with Russia. And there were many factors that led them to be a social welfare state. So I left there thinking it wasn't as simplistic as, well, they're just white. The problem is more with us, not with how they are doing things. So I want to get to some live engagement from the folks who are watching. And I thank the audience for their comments and questions throughout this discussion. So we're going to do a little bit of a lightning round here. So let's see, Natasha is watching, and she asks, do you believe that there is no place for punishment in learning? And because we're doing lightning round, not everyone has to answer, so we can get to as many as possible.
I'll say it's like very easy to look at these things in black and white and not like shades of gray, right? It's very easy for somebody to say, well, until we solve income inequality, until we solve racism, we can't do anything about the prisons. And I think I fundamentally reject that, right? Because we don't think about how what we do now makes things worse, right? The reason why we can't afford to do the thing, quote unquote, afford to do the things for our communities that we do for Lincoln Park is because we spend so much money, right, on these failed measures and incarcerating people and punishing them for the rest of their lives. So this idea that like it's either all punishment or no punishment, like I think that's a very, very, very fine question to have, like debate to have at the bar. But the question right now is, can we make our system less punitive? Can we do things right now that stops people from like actually living their lives in a productive manner? And I think the answer is yes, there are things we can do right now.
I would say there was a consequence. I'm going to be brief, which is that there is a difference between punishment and consequence. And I think we should explore that. It doesn't necessarily have to be, there's consequence.
Stacy on Facebook says, we need to think about language. At a recent CAPS meeting, I heard neighbors and Chicago police officers talk about the bad guys. We need to think about people who commit crimes as our guys.
I think we also need to think about like the word, like crime is like really problematic for me because like retail theft is crime, right? But wage stuff really isn't crime, right? So like what is crime is also like an incredibly important thing, and how we respond to like certain types of crime, right? Certain types of harm we describe as crime, and then we do things that are punitive in response. Other things we don't call crime, but it still produces harm, but because it's not crime, it just is what it is, right? That's another thing that we should think about when we're talking about language.
One person on YouTube has a question and a comment. They write, if we had open prisons, do we believe that people wouldn't reoffend and commit additional crimes, especially if they have a record? Safety of the community is a concern with an open prison model. I will just jump in quickly and say that crime did not go up with the open prison model, but I'll let the rest of you answer that.
I would just say we got closed prisons, and how safe is your community now? I mean, like, I'm just, unless you live, I mean, the safety of the community is the priority. Has it produced baleful results in the community that you live in now? And if it hasn't, then, I mean, you don't lose nothing by trying something new.
Now let's take a look at some of our viewer responses to the questions we asked in our Google form. If you haven't gotten a chance, check out the questions by following the link pinned to the top of the comment section. This question is, should justice and punishment be related? Why or why not? Barbara wrote in our survey, I think it makes more sense to focus on consequences, had to Trina who just said that, rather than punishment. People who commit crimes have been put in untenuous positions. If we focused on the idea that hurt people, we come from a place of compassion and healing rather than punishing those bad people. The other question, how can American justice be more humane? Katie filled out our survey and had this to say, our system can become more humane by providing more sanitary living conditions, proper nutritional food, ventilations in some southern states, and switching from a focus of punishment to rehabilitation. Beth writes, making our system more human will probably require many, many changes. Rehabilitation, education, treating incarcerated people like human beings. And once a person pays their debt to society, there are no other punishments, such as no voting restrictions, problems getting jobs, etc. Another question, what should the consequences for crime be? Or what should be the consequences for crime? Betsy responds, when possible, there should be some work by the person to understand the harm they inflicted and to make some sort of reparation. If the person continues to be a threat or danger to others, then their freedom would have to be constrained. Megan writes, the victims of the crime and or the community affected by the crime should decide what the consequences are, guided by the primary objective of repairing the harm done and preventing future harm. I would love to hear your thoughts on some of those answers, and I'll just kick off. When Bill Cosby was convicted, there was Aisha Simmons, who did a documentary called Know About Rape, said that instead of Bill Cosby going to prison, he should have to have therapy with a Black feminist and donate his money to gender causes that are against gender-based violence, because prisons are a violent place and a prison is not going to rehabilitate him. So just thought I'd drop that there. Well, maybe we can talk some more about the consequences part, since someone else said that. What do you see consequences as accountability? You know, how does that differ from punishment?
I mean, I totally see it as a form of accountability. So I really appreciate the person who talked about like a survivor-led kinds of like justice where we are able to, like, for example, when we're thinking about people experiencing intimate partner violence within their homes, folks having maybe anger management issues, maybe struggling with some sorts of substance use abuses of their own and like projecting that onto others. I think the consequence of like harming or hurting your partner should not be. Right now, the consequence of hurting your partner is that you go to jail, which in turn also hurts your partner, because your partner maybe loses some kind of financial support, and also maybe a loved one, someone who they love, and is not is not an evil person, but who has bouts of, moments where they lose control of themselves, right? And so then a consequence of that would be having to go and learn and unlearn and process and therapize, right? So what I appreciate within the book Incarceration Nation is the way that they described it as like our life is frozen, right? Like where the person can take a pause and recalibrate, right? You have to stop, you know what I mean? You cannot continue to engage in, and potentially hurt others. You have to take a pause and recalibrate. Like I think, and then the consequences live underneath what that recalibration looks like for that unique circumstance and unique survivor. I would say, like Bill Cosby doing that thing, Bill Cosby donating money is actually such a great, that's supporting other survivors of sexual violence, right? And that's power. Bill Cosby going to jail doesn't really do anything for survivors other than say, like, finally it's acknowledged that he did that thing. People are not like, some people are maybe, raising the roof that he's in jail, but many people are like, it has been acknowledged by the state that my experience is real, right? I don't know I hope that answered your question.
Any other comments on thoughts on some of the audience feedback to those questions that we laid out to them?
Yeah, I don't think that we should ignore personal consequences, and I applaud Gina for talking about kind of the contours of what accountability is, right? But what I hate so much is that we center this discussion around personal consequences, and we do very little work on using our resources to ensure that things like this don't happen again. I think the answer to people would say, well, if you put the bad person in jail, they can't commit that harm again. And I think the reality of the situation is that a significant amount of people who commit harm may not touch the justice system, and a significant amount of people who are in the justice system may not be guilty of that harm. So we can't just rely on putting people in jail or putting people in prison as a way to keep us safe. We have to think very deeply about how we're spending the resources that we have to ensure that harm does not happen. And I think it's important to note that harm in our communities are very, very, very concentrated. And then you have much more harm done in particular spaces, but the power, right, to determine how the system exists typically exists outside of those communities. So those communities essentially, I think, find some benefit in just saying, let's lock away the problem, right? And they don't think a lot about what can we do to make this community safer, right? Because just locking people away has failed. So I think we need to think very deeply about how we can spend our limited resources to make all of our communities safer, not just lock away people so that other folks feel safe, right, in the way they live.
I guess I'll add to it. I think the way I look at it, I think that we're living currently, I think what we're seeing in Chicago and across the country really is the consequence of inaction around prisons and jails in the United States, right? I always tell my friends, I got a lot of homies that own businesses and this, that, and the other. And I tell them that like the safety of your business is a direct reflection of the safety of your community. You can't assume that you can do business as usual when the conditions in the community are not usual, right? And so for me, I feel like the consequences, right, that I think we're living in as a society right now I think it is a reaction to something that was something that happened. I don't necessarily feel like we have to. I think we've been extremely consequence heavy, opposed to dealing with like what are the causes and conditions. And that's something that's extremely real to me, that I think that we all need to get to answer. We'd have to, and we wouldn't have to give out, universal consequences, because not every situation is the same. The assumption that we can dictate or we can predict a consequence for an action is part of the problem that we're having right now. We're dealing with the consequence of that right now, right? And so, yeah, I mean, that's my take on it. Like, I think we're living in the consequence right now, currently, of a decision of inaction as it relates to prisons. And so there's a lot of consequences that stem from that.
We are unfortunately out of time this evening, but I want to thank our panelists, Sharon Mitchell Jr., Trina Reynolds Tyler, and Richard Wallace for sharing their voices and their time with us this evening. Thank you so much. Also, thank you to our partners at the Chicago Harris School of Public Policy and the Center for Effective Government. And of course, we want to thank all of you who have tuned into this conversation. We encourage you to provide feedback in our post-event survey, which is linked in the comments section. You can stay connected with WBEZ through our app and follow our coverage of race, class, and communities at WBEZ.org. If you haven't got a chance to listen to the week-long Finland series, please take a listen and email me. I would love to hear your thoughts. You can also find more events by visiting WBEZ.org/events. Good night, and thank you, everyone.